The morning of September 3rd, 1189, dawned crisp and clear over Westminster Abbey. Inside the ancient stone walls, beneath soaring arches that had witnessed the coronation of kings for over a century, Richard Plantagenet knelt before the altar. The Archbishop of Canterbury raised the crown of England above his head, and in that moment, the assembled nobles witnessed not merely the investiture of another monarch, but the birth of a legend that would echo through 8 centuries. Yet even as the golden circlet settled upon his brow, Richard's mind was already elsewhere, across the Channel, beyond the Mediterranean, toward the dusty hills of the Holy Land where Christian and Muslim armies clashed for control of Jerusalem. The crown was merely a means to an end. The true prize lay 3,000 miles away, in the city where Christ had walked, where Saladin's banners now flew over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This was no ordinary king ascending to the throne of England. This was a man who would spend barely 6 months of his 10-year reign in the realm he ruled, who would bankrupt his kingdom to fund a holy war, who would become a prisoner of his enemies yet emerge as the most celebrated warrior of his age. The paradox of Richard Plantagenet, a king who achieved immortality by abandoning his kingdom, begins with understanding not just what he became, but how he chose to become it. To understand Richard the Lionheart, one must first understand that he was never truly English. Born on September 8, 1157, in Oxford, he was the product of 2 extraordinary bloodlines that had reshaped the political landscape of Western Europe. His father, Henry II, was the most powerful monarch of his age, ruling an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. But it was his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who would prove the more decisive influence on the boy who would become a legend. Eleanor was no ordinary medieval queen. At 15, she had inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, making her one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France had ended in scandal and annulment, partly due to her strong-willed nature and partly due to her failure to produce a male heir. When she married Henry Plantagenet in 1152, she brought with her not only the wine-rich lands of Aquitaine, but also the sophisticated court culture of southern France, where troubadours sang of courtly love and chivalric ideals. The boy who would be called Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, grew up in this world of competing loyalties and continental ambitions. While his brothers Henry the Young King and Geoffrey of Brittany were groomed for the northern territories, Richard was destined for Aquitaine, his mother's heritage. From childhood, he was more comfortable speaking the Languedoc of the troubadours than the Norman French of his father's court. He was, in every sense that mattered, a product of the sophisticated warlike culture of Southwestern.
The chronicler Roger of Hoveden, writing with the measured precision of a court insider, noted that Richard showed exceptional promise in the arts of war from an early age. But this was no mere observation about a youth's natural talents. In the volatile world of 12th century politics, military skill was not an ornament, but a necessity. Richard's education was designed to produce not just a duke, but a war leader capable of holding together the fractious nobles of Aquitaine through a combination of charisma, strategic brilliance, and, when necessary, ruthless force. By the age of 11, Richard was already being prepared for independent rule. In 1168, he was invested as Duke of Aquitaine in a ceremony at Poitiers that revealed Eleanor's masterful political choreography. The young duke knelt not in the Gothic splendor of a northern cathedral, but in the ancient church of St. Hilaire, receiving the lance and banner of St. Martial from the hands of the Archbishop of Bordeaux. This was more than ceremonial theatre. It was a declaration that Richard would rule as an Aquitanian prince, not as a remote English overlord. The education that followed was unlike anything experienced by most medieval princes. While his contemporaries learned statecraft through observation and ceremony, Richard learned it through actual governance. Eleanor established him in his own court at Poitiers, surrounding him with the greatest military minds of the age. Here, under the watchful eye of experienced captains, the teenage duke learned the brutal realities of medieval warfare, the art of siege, the psychology of command, the delicate balance between mercy and terror that kept rebellious vassals in line. The true test of Richard's character came not in formal education, but in the crucible of actual warfare. In 1173, when he was barely 16, the Great Rebellion erupted that would define the remainder of Henry II's reign. Eleanor, increasingly estranged from her husband and jealous of his growing power, orchestrated a family revolt that would pit father against sons across the Plantagenet domains. The rebellion the chroniclers would later call the Great Revolt was a masterpiece of political coordination. Eleanor had secretly negotiated with Louis VII of France, her former husband, to provide support for her son's claims to independent rule. Henry, the young king, raised the banner of revolt in Normandy. Geoffrey stirred up trouble in Brittany, and Richard, despite his youth, was expected to hold Aquitaine against his father's inevitable counterattack. For most teenagers, such responsibility would have been overwhelming. For Richard, it became the forge in which his legend was born. When Henry II's forces marched south to subdue the rebellious duchy, they found not a frightened boy but a precociously skilled military commander who had already begun to display the tactical brilliance that would make him famous. Richard's defensive assault in 1174 demonstrated not just courage but strategic acumen that surprised even his father's experienced generals. The siege of Saintes revealed the essential elements of Richard's character that would define his entire career. Faced with overwhelming odds, he chose not to retreat to the safety of his stronger fortresses, but to make a stand that would inspire his followers and demonstrate his personal courage. When the town's defenses were breached, Richard led the counterattack personally, sword in hand, showing the combination of tactical intelligence and personal bravery that would make him legendary. Yet, even as Richard proved his military capabilities, the rebellion revealed the fundamental contradiction that would haunt his relationship with authority throughout his life. He was, by nature and training, a man who demanded independence, yet lived in a world that required submission to paternal authority. The reconciliation with Henry II in 1174 was not a simple father-son reunion, but a complex negotiation between two strong-willed leaders who respected each other's capabilities while remaining fundamentally at odds about the nature of power. Henry II, perhaps recognizing that Richard's talents could not be contained within traditional frameworks, granted him unprecedented autonomy in governing Aquitaine. This was not mere paternal indulgence, but hard-headed political calculation. The southern duchy was notorious for its rebellious nobles and fractious politics. If Richard could master it, he would prove himself worthy of greater responsibilities. If he failed, the lesson would be learned without jeopardizing the core territories of the Plantagenet Empire. The young duke who returned to Poitiers in 1174 was no longer the ceremonial figure who had received the banner of Saint Martial 6 years earlier. He was a proven war leader who had faced his father's best generals and emerged with his reputation intact. More importantly, he had learned the crucial lesson that would guide his entire career, that political authority in the medieval world ultimately rested on the ability to inspire loyalty through personal example rather than abstract legal principles. The next 15 years of Richard's life, from 1174 to 1189, were spent in the demanding apprenticeship of actual rule. Aquitaine was no easy inheritance. The duchy was a patchwork of competing jurisdictions, ancient feudal obligations, and proud noble families who had been governing their own territories since before the Norman conquest. To rule effectively, Richard would need to master not just military strategy, but the subtle arts of diplomacy, alliance building, and the calculated use of both mercy and severity. The chronicler Geoffrey of Vigeois, writing from the monastery of Saint-Martial in Limoges, provides glimpses of Richard's evolving style of governance. Unlike his father, who ruled through a complex bureaucracy and preferred negotiation to confrontation, Richard governed through personal presence and direct action. He was constantly on the move throughout his duchy, appearing suddenly at trouble spots, resolving disputes through personal intervention, and demonstrating that ducal authority was not some distant abstraction, but an immediate physical reality. This hands-on approach to governance served Richard well in the unique political environment of Aquitaine. The nobility of the south were accustomed to rulers who led from the front, who shared the dangers of warfare with their followers, who proved their right to command through personal excellence rather than inherited privilege. Richard's reputation as a warrior began to grow, not from a single dramatic victory, but from countless smaller engagements where he consistently demonstrated the courage, skill, and strategic insight that marked him as exceptional. Perhaps most importantly, Richard's years in Aquitaine coincided with the flowering of what historians would later call the chivalric ideal, the complex code of values that emphasized personal honor, loyalty to one's lord, protection of the weak, and devotion to the Christian faith. This was not merely a literary movement, but a profound cultural transformation that was reshaping how the warrior class understood their role in society. Richard absorbed these ideals not through academic study, but through lived experience in the very region where they were taking their most sophisticated form. The court at Poitiers, under Eleanor's guidance, became a center of cultural innovation, where troubadours refined the concepts of courtly love, where scholars debated the proper relationship between earthly and spiritual authority, and where young nobles learned that true greatness required more than military prowess. The fusion of martial excellence with moral purpose that would characterize Richard's approach to the Crusades was forged in these years of governing Aquitaine. He learned to see himself not merely as a territorial lord, but as a Christian knight whose authority derived from his willingness to defend the faith and protect those who could not protect themselves. This was not mere ideological posturing, but a practical recognition that effective leadership in the medieval world required moral as well as military credibility.
By the 1180s, Richard had transformed himself from a rebellious teenager into one of the most formidable rulers in Western Europe. His mastery of Aquitaine was complete, his reputation as a warrior was unquestioned, and his understanding of political strategy had matured through years of practical experience. Yet he remained subordinate to his father, still technically heir to the English throne, but with no clear path to the independent authority he craved. The death of Henry the young king in 1183 suddenly elevated Richard to the position of heir apparent. But this promotion came with complications. Henry II expected his eldest surviving son to surrender Aquitaine to his younger brother John, following the traditional practice of providing each son with territorial authority. For Richard, this was unthinkable. Aquitaine was not merely his inheritance, but his identity, the source of his power, the foundation of his reputation, the land he had earned through 15 years of constant warfare and governance. The refusal to surrender Aquitaine set Richard on a collision course with his father that would define the final years of Henry II's reign. This was not merely a family quarrel, but a fundamental conflict between two different visions of how the Plantagenet Empire should be organized and governed. Henry II, despite his own rebellious youth, had come to believe in the paramount importance of hierarchical authority and unified command. Richard, shaped by his years of independent governance in Aquitaine, believed that effective leadership required the freedom to make autonomous decisions and the authority to implement them without interference. The confrontation that began in 1183 escalated steadily through the remainder of the decade. Richard found himself in the strange position of being simultaneously his father's heir and his father's enemy, loyal to the Plantagenet dynasty, yet in rebellion against its current head. This contradiction was resolved through a characteristic piece of political theater that demonstrated both Richard's strategic brilliance and his willingness to embrace dramatic gestures when they served his purposes.
In the summer of 1189, Richard made the decision that would define the remainder of his life. Rather than continue the feudal struggle against his father, he chose to ally himself with Philip Augustus of France, Henry II's greatest enemy. This was not mere opportunism, but a calculated gamble that demonstrated Richard's understanding of the larger political forces reshaping Western Europe. The alliance with Philip Augustus was predicated on a shared commitment to the Third Crusade, the great expedition that was then being organized in response to Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem. By positioning himself as a crusader, Richard transformed his rebellion against paternal authority into a holy war for the liberation of the Holy Land. This was political genius of the highest order, a maneuver that simultaneously justified his defiance of his father while establishing his credentials as a Christian knight worthy of universal support. The final confrontation between Henry II and Richard came in July 1189 at the castle of Chinon in the Loire Valley. The aged king, worn down by decades of warfare and weakened by the defection of his chosen heir, agreed to terms that effectively recognized Richard's independence. But the victory came at a terrible personal cost. Henry II died just 2 days after the agreement was signed, leaving Richard to inherit a throne that he had won through rebellion against the very man who had shaped his character and taught him the arts of kingship. The chronicler Gerald of Wales, who witnessed the final meeting between father and son, recorded a moment that revealed the complexity of Richard's character. When the young duke knelt beside his father's deathbed, Henry II whispered words that would haunt Richard for the remainder of his life. "You have taken my kingdom, but you have not taken my blessing." The man who would become the Lionheart had achieved the independence he had always craved, but at the cost of the paternal approval he had never stopped seeking. The coronation at Westminster Abbey on September 3, 1189, marked not just the beginning of Richard's reign, but the moment when the man became the myth. The 32-year-old king who knelt before the altar that morning was no longer merely the Duke of Aquitaine or the heir to the Plantagenet throne. He was the embodiment of the chivalric ideal, the Christian knight who had sacrificed family harmony for the higher purpose of liberating the Holy Land. Yet even as the crown was placed upon his head, Richard's thoughts were already turning eastward. The Kingdom of England, for all its wealth and strategic importance, was merely a means to an end. The true prize lay in the Holy Land, where Saladin's armies had undone nearly a century of Christian conquest, and where the greatest military challenge of the age awaited the man who would prove himself worthy of the title Lionheart. The boy who had learned warfare in the rebellious Duchy of Aquitaine, who had defied his father to claim his inheritance, who had transformed family conflict into holy war, was about to embark on the adventure that would define his place in history. The Third Crusade awaited, and with it, the confrontation with Saladin that would test everything Richard had learned about leadership, warfare, and the complex relationship between personal ambition and moral purpose. In the space of 32 years, Richard Plantagenet had transformed himself from a rebellious youth into the most celebrated warrior of his age. The choices he had made, to embrace his Aquitanian heritage, to master the arts of warfare and governance, to defy paternal authority in service of a higher calling, had forged a character uniquely suited to the challenges that lay ahead. The man who would become the Lionheart was ready to claim his place in the eternal struggle between cross and crescent, between the Christian dream of Jerusalem and the Islamic reality of Saladin's just rule. But first, he had to cross the Mediterranean, gather his armies, and prove that the legend of Richard Coeur de Lion was more than mere poetic invention. The greatest test of his life was about to begin. The autumn wind of 1189 carried with it more than the salt tang of the English Channel as Richard Plantagenet stood on the cliffs of Dover, gazing eastward toward the continent that had shaped his character and now called him to his destiny. Behind him lay the machinery of English royal administration, already grinding into motion under the capable hands of his appointed regents.
Ahead lay the greatest military challenge of the medieval world, the reconquest of the Holy Land from Saladin's disciplined armies. The king, who prepared to cross the Channel that October morning, was no longer the rebellious duke who had defied his father for 15 years. The crown had transformed him, not through any mystical alchemy of kingship, but through the brutal clarity of absolute responsibility. Every decision from this moment forward would echo through history. Every choice would be weighed not just against military necessity, but against the moral imperatives of Christian knighthood that had shaped his understanding of leadership since childhood. Richard's first act as king revealed the man he had become. Rather than consolidating his hold on the English throne through the traditional methods of royal patronage and administrative reform, he chose instead to liquidate the kingdom's resources for a single, overwhelming purpose. "I would sell London itself, if I could find a buyer," he reportedly declared to his closest advisors. This was not reckless abandon, but calculated sacrifice, the decision of a man who understood that some prizes were worth any price. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden, writing with the measured precision of a court insider, recorded the extraordinary efficiency with which Richard transformed the wealth of England into the sinews of war. Sheriffdoms were sold to the highest bidders, royal lands were mortgaged to Italian bankers, and the great offices of state were auctioned to nobles willing to pay premium prices for the privilege of governing in the king's absence. Within 6 months of his coronation, Richard had assembled a war chest that dwarfed the resources of any previous crusading expedition. But Richard's genius lay not merely in gathering resources, but in understanding how to deploy them effectively. The army that began assembling in the ports of southern England during the winter of 1189-1190 was unlike any force that had previously taken the cross. This was not a feudal levy held together by personal loyalty and religious enthusiasm, but a professional military organization built around the most advanced military technology of the age. The core of Richard's force consisted of the Angevine heavy cavalry that had dominated European battlefields for a generation. These were not the random knights of romance, but carefully selected warriors who had proven their worth in the constant warfare of the continental domains. Men like Baldwin de Bethune, who had served Richard since his youth in Aquitaine, and Robert de Sablé, whose tactical brilliance had helped secure the duchy against repeated rebellions, formed the nucleus of a command structure that combined aristocratic leadership with professional competence. Around this cavalry corps, Richard assembled the most formidable siege train ever assembled by a Western European ruler. The great trebuchets and mangonels that would batter the walls of Acre were not crude medieval catapults, but sophisticated machines designed by the finest military engineers of the age. Richard's understanding of siege warfare, honed through decades of reducing rebellious castles in Aquitaine, had taught him that in the rocky terrain of the Holy Land, victory would belong to the side that could most efficiently breach fortified positions. Perhaps most importantly, Richard recognized that success in the eastern Mediterranean would require naval supremacy. The fleet that sailed from English ports in the spring of 1190 represented a revolution in medieval naval warfare. These were not converted merchant vessels, but purpose-built warships designed to transport heavy cavalry, siege equipment, and supplies across the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean. The logistical achievement of coordinating this maritime expedition while simultaneously managing the complexities of continental politics demonstrated strategic capabilities that would have impressed even his father. The first test of Richard's leadership came not in the Holy Land, but in the deceptively peaceful waters of the Mediterranean. When the crusading fleet arrived at Messina in September 1190, the king found himself confronted with a political crisis that threatened to derail the entire expedition before it could engage the enemy. Tancred of Lecce, the Norman ruler of Sicily, had seized the dowry of Richard's sister Joan, the widowed queen of the island, and was demanding ransom for her release. For most medieval rulers, this would have been a minor diplomatic inconvenience to be resolved through negotiation and compromise. For Richard, it became an opportunity to demonstrate the principles that would guide his approach to crusading warfare. The young king, who had learned his trade in the rebellious Duchy of Aquitaine, understood that effective leadership required the willingness to fight for principle, even when pragmatic considerations suggested accommodation.
The siege of Messina that followed was a masterpiece of controlled violence. Richard's forces stormed the city with an efficiency that shocked both allies and enemies. But the conquest was followed by a display of disciplined restraint that revealed the moral framework within which the Lionheart operated. Civilian populations were protected, churches were spared, and the city's commercial life was restored with a speed that demonstrated Richard's understanding of the relationship between military success and political legitimacy. The chronicler Ambrose, whose verse account of the Third Crusade provides invaluable insight into Richard's character, recorded the king's explanation of his actions to the assembled crusading leaders. "We have not taken the cross to make war upon Christians, but to demonstrate that Christian arms serve Christian justice. Let no man doubt that we will show the same mercy to those who submit, and the same severity to those who resist, whether they be Christian or Saracen." The transformation of the Third Crusade from a desperate rescue mission into a campaign of conquest began with Richard's decision to intervene in the affairs of Cyprus, when storms scattered the crusading fleet in April 1191, forcing several ships carrying Richard's treasure and his bride-to-be, Berengaria of Navarre, to seek shelter in Cypriot waters. The island's ruler Isaac Komnenos made the fatal error of attempting to seize the wealth of the King of England. The conquest of Cyprus that followed was Richard's first independent command against a significant enemy, and it revealed the tactical brilliance that would make him legendary. Unlike the siege warfare that had dominated his campaigns in Aquitaine, the conquest of Cyprus required the kind of rapid, mobile operations that would characterize his battles against Saladin. The speed with which Richard's forces overran the island's defenses, the precision of their amphibious operations, and the discipline they maintained in victory all demonstrated that the Lionheart had mastered the art of warfare in all its forms. But the Cypriot campaign also revealed the moral complexity that would define Richard's approach to the crusade. Isaac Komnenos was a Christian ruler, albeit one who had aligned himself with Saladin against the crusading states. His defeat and capture raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of holy war and the proper relationship between religious conviction and political necessity. Richard's solution was characteristically direct. Cyprus would be held not as conquered territory, but as a forward base for the liberation of the Holy Land, its resources dedicated to the service of the cross rather than the enrichment of the crown. When Richard's fleet finally appeared off the coast of Acre on June 8, 1191, the sight that greeted the king was both inspiring and sobering. The great fortress city, which had withstood nearly 2 years of siege by the combined forces of Guy of Lusignan and Conrad of Montferrat, was still flying Saladin's banners from its massive walls. Around the city, the crusading army was entrenched in a double ring of fortifications, besieging the city while simultaneously being besieged by Saladin's relief forces in the hills above. The stalemate at Acre had become a symbol of the crusading movement's decline. For nearly a century, Christian armies had dominated the battlefields of the Holy Land through superior heavy cavalry and the moral authority of the cross. Now, faced with Saladin's tactical innovations and the disciplined resistance of Muslim forces, the flower of European chivalry found itself locked in a grinding war of attrition that seemed to favor the defenders. Richard's arrival transformed the dynamics of the siege with dramatic suddenness. The king, who had learned his trade in the castle warfare of Aquitaine, immediately grasped the technical problems that had stymied his predecessors. The walls of Acre were too strong to be breached by conventional assault, but they were vulnerable to the kind of systematic siege warfare that Richard had perfected during his campaigns against rebellious vassals. The great siege engines that Richard's engineers erected outside Acre's walls were marvels of medieval military technology. The chronicler, Geoffrey of Vinzaf, recorded that the king's principal trebuchet, which he had personally named God's Own Sling, could hurl stones weighing over 300 pounds with sufficient force to crack the massive limestone blocks of the city's fortifications. But Richard understood that technology alone would not win the siege. Victory would require the kind of sustained, coordinated effort that could only be achieved through effective leadership and unwavering determination. The technical aspects of the siege of Acre revealed Richard's evolution from a talented duke into a master of the military arts. The investment of the city required not just the deployment of siege engines, but the coordination of naval forces, the management of supply lines, and the maintenance of discipline among a polyglot army that included English longbowmen, French knights, Italian crossbowmen, and Levantine auxiliaries. Richard's genius lay in his ability to transform this diverse force into a unified instrument of war. The chronicler Ambroise recorded numerous instances of the king's personal intervention in tactical details, from the placement of mangonels to the timing of naval attacks. But perhaps more importantly, Richard understood that the siege of Acre was as much a battle of wills as a contest of military technology. The defenders' morale had to be broken, while the attackers' resolve had to be sustained through what promised to be a prolonged and costly investment. The king's personal example proved decisive in maintaining crusading morale. When fever struck the army in June 1191, Richard was among the first to fall ill, but he insisted on directing the siege from his sickbed, having himself carried to the front lines on a litter so that his presence would inspire the troops. When supplies ran low, he shared the hardships of common soldiers, accepting the same rations and enduring the same privations that tested the resolve of his followers. This was more than mere gesture politics. Richard understood that leadership in the medieval world required the physical presence of the leader, the visible demonstration that authority was earned through shared sacrifice rather than inherited privilege. The man who had learned his trade in the rebellious duchy of Aquitaine recognized that the diverse forces under his command would respond to personal example rather than abstract appeals to duty or religious conviction. The illness that struck Richard during the siege of Acre provides crucial insight into the character of the man who would become the Lionheart. The fever that prostrated him for nearly a month was not merely a personal crisis, but a test of the entire crusading enterprise. With their most capable leader incapacitated, the crusading forces faced the possibility of defeat at the moment when victory seemed within reach. Richard's response to his illness revealed the depth of his commitment to the crusading cause. Despite his physician's warnings that continued activity might prove fatal, the king insisted on maintaining personal supervision of the siege. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden recorded that Richard had himself carried to the walls of Acre on a litter, from which he continued to direct the placement of siege engines and the coordination of naval attacks. This was not mere stubbornness, but a clear-eyed assessment of the political realities of crusading warfare. The army besieging Acre was held together by personal loyalty to individual leaders rather than abstract commitment to the crusading cause. Without Richard's visible presence, the English contingent might withdraw, the French might pursue their own objectives, and the entire enterprise might collapse into the kind of factional warfare that had characterized the crusading movement since its inception. The decision to continue fighting despite his illness also revealed Richard's understanding of the symbolic importance of leadership in medieval warfare. The king who appeared before the walls of Acre, pale and weak but still directing the assault, became a living embodiment of the crusading ideal. His willingness to risk death for the liberation of the Holy Land inspired his followers while demonstrating to his enemies that Christian determination could not be broken by physical hardship. The fall of Acre on July 12, 1191, marked the first major Christian victory in the Holy Land since Saladin's conquests 4 years earlier. The moment when Saladin's banners were torn from the city's walls and replaced with the standards of England, France, and Austria, was celebrated throughout the Christian world as proof that the tide of war had finally turned. But Richard's behavior in the hour of victory revealed the complexity of his character and the moral ambiguities that would define his crusading career. When Leopold of Austria presumed to display his banner alongside those of the kings of England and France, Richard personally tore it down, demonstrating the pride and sense of hierarchy that would eventually lead to his captivity. When the city's Muslim population sought terms of surrender, Richard initially granted them the merciful treatment
that had characterized Saladin's own conquests, recognizing that magnanimity in victory served both moral and practical purposes. The celebration of victory was brief, however, as the crusading leaders found themselves confronted with the harsh realities of medieval warfare. The capture of Acre had been achieved at enormous cost in lives and resources, and the city's walls were filled with nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners whose presence posed both a strategic and logistical challenge. The question of how to handle these captives would test Richard's character and reveal the brutal calculations that warfare imposed even on the most idealistic leaders. The events of August 20th, 1191, represent the most controversial episode of Richard's crusading career and the moment when the moral complexities of holy war became impossible to ignore. When negotiations with Saladin over the exchange of prisoners reached an impasse, Richard made the decision that would stain his reputation for centuries. He ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim captives in full view of Saladin's army. The chronicler Ambroise, who witnessed the massacre, recorded the king's justification in terms that reveal both the strategic logic and moral anguish of the decision. The king saw that the Saracens would not keep their covenant, and that every day that passed weakened our forces, while strengthening theirs. Better to end this matter swiftly than to see the entire enterprise fail through delay and indecision. Modern historians have struggled to place this atrocity in its proper context, but the medieval sources make clear that Richard's decision was not the product of bloodthirsty fanaticism, but of brutal military calculation. The crusading army lacked the resources to guard such a large number of prisoners while simultaneously pursuing the campaign for Jerusalem. Saladin's delays in implementing the agreed exchange seemed to suggest that he was using the negotiations to buy time for his own forces to regroup and counterattack. Yet the massacre also revealed the moral limitations of Richard's approach to crusading warfare. The king, who had learned to balance mercy with severity in governing Aquitaine, found himself trapped by the logic of holy war, unable to extend the same pragmatic clemency to Muslim enemies that he had shown to Christian rebels. The man who would become the Lionheart had discovered that the transition from Duke to Crusader required moral compromises that tested the very ideals he claimed to serve. The aftermath of the Acre massacre revealed the psychological toll that crusading warfare exacted even on its most successful practitioners. The chronicler Geoffrey of Vinceul recorded that Richard spent the night following the executions in prayer, seeking absolution for an act that he recognized as necessary, but not righteous. The king, who had always prided himself on the moral authority of his cause, now found himself confronted with the terrible reality that holy war, however justified its ultimate objectives, required unholy means. This crisis of conscience was not unique to Richard, but reflected the broader contradictions of the crusading movement itself. The knights who had taken the cross to liberate the Holy Land found themselves engaged in a war that seemed to demand the abandonment of the very Christian virtues they claimed to defend. The tension between the ideals of chivalry and the realities of warfare that had shaped Richard's character since childhood now became a source of profound internal conflict. Yet Richard's response to this moral crisis revealed the resilience that had enabled him to survive decades of political and military challenges. Rather than retreating into cynicism or abandoning his crusading vows, he chose to recommit himself to the original purpose of the expedition. The liberation of Jerusalem would justify the terrible costs of the campaign, but only if the crusading army could maintain the discipline and determination necessary to achieve that ultimate objective. The departure from Acre in August 1191 marked the beginning of the most challenging phase of Richard's crusading career. The march south toward Jerusalem would test every aspect of his military leadership, from tactical innovation to strategic planning to the psychological management of a diverse and increasingly demoralized army. The king, who had learned his trade in the relatively civilized warfare of Western Europe,
now faced the challenge of conducting operations in the harsh environment of the Levantine coast, against an enemy who had proven capable of adapting to every Western tactical innovation. Saladin's strategy for defending the Holy Land was based on a clear understanding of the logistical constraints facing any crusading army. The Christian forces were dependent on supply lines that stretched across the Mediterranean, while Muslim forces could draw on the resources of an entire civilization. Time favored the defenders, who could afford to trade space for the gradual attrition of their enemy's strength and morale. Richard's response to this strategic challenge demonstrated the tactical genius that would make him legendary. Rather than attempting the kind of rapid advance that had characterized earlier crusading campaigns, he chose to organize the march toward Jerusalem as a moving fortress, a disciplined formation that could maintain its cohesion while advancing steadily toward its objective. The chronicler Ambroise recorded the meticulous planning that went into this operation, from the coordination of naval support to the rotation of units to the maintenance of discipline under constant harassment. The formation that Richard devised for the march to Arsuf was a masterpiece of military organization. The army advanced in 3 parallel columns, with the baggage train protected in the center and the flanks secured by alternating formations of cavalry and infantry. Crossbowmen provided covering fire, while spearmen maintained the tactical formations necessary to repel cavalry charges. Most importantly, the entire force moved according to a carefully orchestrated plan that minimized the opportunities for Saladin's forces to achieve tactical surprise. The confrontation at Arsuf on September 7, 1191, represented the climax of Richard's tactical evolution and the moment when his reputation as a military commander was definitively established. When Saladin's forces finally committed to a major battle, attempting to destroy the crusading army through a coordinated assault on its flanks and rear, Richard faced the supreme test of his leadership abilities. The battle began with the kind of harassment tactics that had characterized Muslim warfare throughout the campaign. Saladin's light cavalry attacked the crusading columns from multiple directions, seeking to break their formation and create opportunities for decisive strikes. The chronicler Ambroise recorded the tremendous discipline required to maintain the march formation under such intense pressure, with individual knights forced to absorb punishment without breaking ranks to pursue their tormentors. Richard's genius lay in his ability to transform this apparent weakness into tactical advantage. By maintaining strict discipline and refusing to be drawn into premature attacks, he allowed Saladin's forces to commit themselves to increasingly desperate assaults. When the Muslim cavalry finally overextended themselves in an attempt to break the Christian formation, Richard unleashed the devastating counterattack that would become the stuff of legend. The charge at Arsuf was not merely a tactical maneuver, but a work of military art. The chronicler Geoffrey of Vinsauf described the moment when Richard's heavy cavalry struck the exposed flank of Saladin's army. It was as if the very earth trembled beneath the hooves of the Christian horses, and the Saracens, who had seemed so confident in their numbers, suddenly found themselves scattered like leaves before the storm.
The victory at Arsuf established Richard's reputation as the finest military commander of his generation and earned him the title by which history would remember him. The chronicler Ambroise recorded that Muslim prisoners taken after the battle spoke of the King of England as Melek Rik, the Lion King, whose personal courage and tactical brilliance had transformed the demoralized crusading army into a force capable of challenging Saladin's supremacy. But the battle also revealed the limitations of Richard's strategic position. The victory at Arsuf had been achieved through superior discipline and tactical innovation, but it had not fundamentally altered the balance of forces in the Holy Land. Saladin's army had been defeated but not destroyed, and the Muslim leader retained the strategic advantages of interior lines, local support, and unlimited time to rebuild his forces. Richard's response to this strategic reality demonstrated the mature understanding of warfare that had emerged from his decades of experience in continental politics. Rather than pursuing the kind of dramatic gesture that might have appealed to his younger self, he chose to consolidate his gains and prepare for the longer campaign that would be necessary to achieve his ultimate objective. The march from Arsuf to Jaffa revealed Richard's evolution from a talented duke into a master of the military arts. The army that had struggled to maintain its formation during the harassment of the coastal march now moved with the confidence of a force that understood its own capabilities and trusted its leadership. The king who had learned his trade in the rebellious Duchy of Aquitaine had proven that his tactical innovations could succeed even against the most skilled opponents. The final phase of Richard's crusading campaign began with the advance inland from Jaffa toward Jerusalem in October 1191. This was the moment that the entire expedition had been organized to achieve, the climactic confrontation between Christian and Muslim forces for control of the Holy City. Yet as the crusading army approached the hills surrounding Jerusalem, Richard found himself confronted with strategic challenges that would test his leadership more severely than any battlefield encounter. The problem was not military, but logistical. The capture of Jerusalem would require a lengthy siege, but the crusading army lacked the resources to sustain such an operation while simultaneously defending its supply lines from Saladin's forces. The city's powerful fortifications, recently strengthened by Saladin's engineers, would require the kind of systematic investment that had succeeded at Acre. But the approaches to Jerusalem were dominated by hills that favored the defenders. More fundamentally, Richard recognized that the conquest of Jerusalem would be meaningless unless the crusading states could develop the permanent military strength necessary to hold the city against future Muslim attacks. The history of the crusading movement had demonstrated that dramatic victories were worthless without the institutional foundations necessary to sustain them. The king who had learned statecraft in the complex politics of Aquitaine understood that lasting success required more than military triumph. The decision to halt the advance on Jerusalem 20 miles from the city represented the most difficult choice of Richard's crusading career. The king who had risked everything to take the cross, who had bankrupted his kingdom to finance the expedition, who had earned his reputation through uncompromising pursuit of victory, now chose to accept the limitations of the possible rather than chase the dream of the perfect. The chronicler Ambrose recorded the agonizing deliberations that led to this decision. The crusading army's morale had been sustained throughout the campaign by the promise of Jerusalem, and many knights felt that turning back so close to their goal represented a betrayal of their crusading vows. Richard's response revealed the moral complexity that had always characterized his approach to leadership. Sometimes the greatest courage was required not to fight, but to recognize when fighting would serve no useful purpose. The retreat from the approaches to Jerusalem was conducted with the same tactical brilliance that had characterized the march from Acre. Richard understood that the withdrawal would be seen as a defeat by both his own forces and his enemies, and he took extraordinary measures to maintain the army's cohesion and morale. The formation that had protected the crusading force during its advance was adapted to provide security during the more dangerous operation of withdrawal under pressure. The negotiations between Richard and Saladin that accompanied the final phase of the crusading campaign revealed the mutual respect that had developed between the two greatest military leaders of their age. The chronicler Baha'u'ddin ibn Shaddad, writing from the Muslim perspective, recorded numerous instances of chivalrous behavior on both sides, from the exchange of gifts during truces to the provision of medical assistance during illness. This relationship between enemies was not merely a product of shared aristocratic values, but reflected the recognition that both leaders faced similar challenges in maintaining the loyalty of diverse and fractious followers. Richard's problems with the French contingent and the Palestinian nobility paralleled Saladin's difficulties with his own emirs and the broader Muslim world. Both men had learned that effective leadership required the careful balance of principle and pragmatism, idealism and realism. The famous exchange of letters between the two leaders, preserved in both Christian and Muslim sources, revealed the intellectual sophistication that both men brought to their conflict. When Richard proposed that the territorial disputes of the Holy Land might be resolved through the marriage of his sister Joan to Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, the Muslim leader's response demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that had made him successful. The proposal was ultimately rejected,
but the fact that it was seriously considered by both sides revealed the pragmatic approach that both leaders brought to their seemingly irreconcilable conflict. The agreement that ended the Third Crusade in September 1192 represented neither the triumph that Richard had hoped for, nor the disaster that his enemies had predicted. The Treaty of Jaffa established a 3-year truce that recognized the territorial status quo, while providing for Christian pilgrimage rights to Jerusalem. From a strategic perspective, the treaty preserved the rump crusading states along the coast, while acknowledging Muslim control of the interior, including the Holy City itself. For Richard, the treaty represented the mature acceptance of political reality that had characterized his evolution from rebellious duke to responsible king. The man who had learned his trade in the complex politics of Aquitaine understood that lasting agreements required the consent of all parties and the recognition of legitimate interests on both sides. The treaty was not perfect from a Christian perspective, but it provided the foundation for a stable peace that would endure long after both Richard and Saladin had passed from the scene. The chronicler Ambroise recorded the king's final words to his army before departing the Holy Land. "We have not achieved all that we hoped, but we have achieved what was possible. The Holy Land remains free for Christian pilgrims. The coastal cities remain in Christian hands, and the flower of European chivalry has demonstrated that Muslim conquest is not inevitable. Let those who come after us build upon what we have accomplished."
The Richard who sailed from Acre in October 1192 was a fundamentally different man from the newly crowned king who had departed England 3 years earlier. The crusading campaign had tested every aspect of his character, from his tactical brilliance to his strategic judgment to his moral resilience. The man who had learned his trade in the rebellious duchy of Aquitaine had proven that his talents could succeed even in the harsh environment of the Holy Land. But perhaps most importantly, the Third Crusade had taught Richard the limits of individual heroism and the importance of institutional strength. The king, who had always prided himself on personal achievement, now understood that lasting success required the kind of collaborative effort that could only be achieved through effective leadership and patient diplomacy. The lesson was bitter, but necessary. Even the Lionheart could not single-handedly reshape the balance of power in the medieval world. The voyage home would bring new challenges and ultimate captivity, but Richard's reputation had been secured by his conduct during the crusading campaign. The man who had earned the title Coeur de Lion through his courage at Arsuf and his wisdom in the approach to Jerusalem had demonstrated that individual excellence could still matter in an age of increasing political complexity. The legend of the Lionheart was born, not from fairy tale heroism, but from the hard-won recognition that true leadership required the courage to make difficult choices and the wisdom to accept imperfect outcomes. As the ships carrying the crusading army disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind the ancient hills of the Holy Land, Richard could reflect on a campaign that had fallen short of its ultimate objectives, but had achieved something perhaps more valuable: the demonstration that Christian civilization could produce leaders capable of matching the greatest achievements of their enemies. The Third Crusade had ended in compromise rather than conquest, but it had proven that the age of crusading was far from over. The cross and the crescent would meet again, but when they did, both sides would remember the mutual respect that had emerged from the crucible of the Holy Land. In the end, Richard's crusading career had been defined not by the cities he had conquered or the battles he had won, but by the man he had become through the process of testing his ideals against the harsh realities of medieval warfare. The Lionheart who departed the Holy Land in 1192 was a leader who had learned to balance courage with wisdom, principle with pragmatism, and personal ambition with collective responsibility. These were the qualities that would sustain him through the trials that lay ahead, and that would secure his place in the eternal struggle between the forces of order and chaos, faith and doubt, hope and despair that define the medieval world.
The Mediterranean winds of October 1192 carried more than salt spray as Richard's ship departed the ancient port of Acre for the final time. Behind him lay the Holy Land, its hills still echoing with the clash of steel and the cries of the faithful. Ahead lay the treacherous passage home through waters controlled by enemies who had learned to hate the name of the English king. The man who had earned immortality through 3 years of crusading warfare was about to discover that legend-making required more than battlefield glory. It demanded the kind of suffering that transforms human achievement into eternal myth. The chronicler Ambroise, who had witnessed Richard's triumphs at Arsuf and Acre, recorded the somber mood that pervaded the royal fleet as it navigated the dangerous currents of the eastern Mediterranean. This was not the triumphant homecoming that had been envisioned 3 years earlier, when the flower of European chivalry had sailed eastward with dreams of liberating Jerusalem. The Treaty of Jaffa had secured Christian access to the Holy City and preserved the coastal strongholds, but it had fallen short of the total victory that had justified such enormous sacrifice. Yet even in apparent defeat, Richard's strategic mind was already working to transform the political realities of his situation. The king who had learned statecraft in the complex politics of Aquitaine understood that the perception of success often mattered more than its substance. The crusading expedition had demonstrated that Saladin's conquests were not irreversible, that Christian armies could still match Muslim forces in the field, and that the ideal of holy war retained its power to inspire extraordinary sacrifice. These achievements would form the foundation of a reputation that would outlast kingdoms.
The decision to travel overland through the territories of his enemies was born of necessity rather than choice. The direct sea route home was blocked by the fleets of Philip Augustus, who had returned to France determined to exploit Richard's absence by seizing the Angevin territories on the continent. The alternative routes, through Italy, were controlled by allies of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who had his own reasons for wanting to settle accounts with the English king. This left only the dangerous passage through the Balkans, where Duke Leopold of Austria nursed grievances dating back to the humiliation at Acre. The chronicler Roger of Hoofden recorded the careful preparations that Richard made for this perilous journey. The king adopted the disguise of a merchant named Hugh, traveling with a small escort that included his most trusted knights and a handful of servants. This was not the first time that Richard had relied on deception to achieve his objectives, but it was the first time that his legendary reputation worked against him. The man who had become famous throughout Europe for his distinctive appearance and commanding presence could not easily disappear into anonymity. The irony was bitter. Richard's greatest strength had become his greatest vulnerability. The reputation that had made him the most celebrated warrior of his age also made him the most recognizable target. Every innkeeper, every merchant, every petty official along the route knew the stories of the Lionheart's exploits. The very fame that had elevated him above ordinary mortality now threatened to destroy him through the most mundane of betrayals.
The capture near Vienna on December 20th, 1192 came not through military defeat, but through the kind of casual recognition that had haunted Richard throughout his journey. The chronicler details vary, but the essential facts are clear. Richard was betrayed by a money changer who recognized the distinctive ring he wore, or perhaps by his inability to perfectly disguise his noble bearing, or simply by the ill luck that had begun to stalk him since his departure from the Holy Land. Duke Leopold's men found the King of England in a roadside inn, disguised as a servant but still carrying himself with the unmistakable authority of a man born to command. The moment of recognition was followed by a brief, desperate struggle that ended with Richard's surrender to overwhelming numbers. The man who had never been defeated in battle was finally brought low by the most prosaic of circumstances: exhaustion, isolation, and the inevitable working of political necessity. The chronicler, Ambroise, recorded the Duke's words upon seeing his famous prisoner. "So this is the great Lionheart, the terror of the Saracens.
the champion of Christendom, he looks remarkably like a tired merchant to me. The mockery was calculated to wound Richard's pride, but it also revealed the transformation that would define the next phase of his legend. The king, who had ruled through personal presence and military achievement, would now have to demonstrate his greatness through the more subtle arts of endurance and political maneuvering.
It was during the dark months of captivity that the title Lionheart evolved from military nickname into mythic identity. The chroniclers who recorded Richard's imprisonment noted that his Muslim enemies had begun calling him Melik Rik, the Lion King, during the siege of Acre, a recognition of his personal courage and tactical brilliance. But it was the French troubadours and English chroniclers who transformed this battlefield epithet into something approaching religious veneration. The symbolic power of the lion had deep roots in medieval Christian culture. The lion was the king of beasts, the symbol of courage and nobility, but also the emblem of Christ's resurrection and the righteous fury of divine justice. When applied to Richard, the title Coeur de Lion suggested not merely personal bravery, but a kind of sacred authority that transcended ordinary political categories. The imprisoned king became a living embodiment of the chivalric ideal, a martyr hero whose suffering sanctified his cause. The chronicler Geoffrey of Vinzolf recorded how the name spread throughout Europe during Richard's captivity. In every castle hall, in every monastery scriptorium, in every merchant's tavern, men spoke of the Lionheart's imprisonment as they might speak of the passion of a saint. The king who had taken the cross to liberate Jerusalem had become himself a symbol of Christian suffering, a reminder that even the greatest champions of the faith must endure the trials that test the soul.
The castle of Dürnstein, perched on its rocky outcrop above the Danube, became the stage for one of the most dramatic episodes in medieval political theater. The fortress that held the most famous prisoner in Europe was transformed into a symbol of the struggle between temporal and spiritual authority, between the claims of political necessity and the demands of Christian chivalry. Here, in a stone cell overlooking the river that had carried the armies of Charlemagne and the commerce of generations, Richard confronted the ultimate test of his character. The conditions of his imprisonment were not brutal by the standards of the age, but they were designed to break the spirit of a man accustomed to constant action and absolute authority. Richard was held in comfortable quarters, provided with adequate food and clothing, and allowed to receive visitors and conduct correspondence. But he was also completely cut off from the political and military activities that had defined his identity since childhood. The chronicler Ambroise recorded the king's initial response to his captivity. He who had never known defeat in battle now faced the most difficult campaign of his life, the conquest of his own impatience and the disciplining of his legendary pride. The man who had always solved problems through decisive action now had to learn the harder lesson of strategic patience. When Duke Leopold transferred his famous prisoner to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI in early 1193, the stakes of Richard's captivity rose dramatically. The sum demanded, 150,000 marks of silver, roughly equivalent to 3 years' revenue from the English crown, was calculated not merely to enrich the imperial treasury, but to demonstrate the emperor's power over the greatest warrior of the age. This was political theater on a continental scale, a public humiliation designed to elevate Henry VI's prestige at the expense of Richard's legend. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden recorded the emperor's justification for the enormous ransom. "The King of England has stirred up the world with his wars, has brought discord to the Holy Land, and has shown himself the enemy of our allies. Let him pay the price of his ambitions, and let all men see that imperial authority is not mocked with impunity."
The language was carefully chosen to present Richard's imprisonment as just punishment for his crusading activities, a response to legitimate grievances rather than simple extortion. But the demand also revealed the emperor's recognition of Richard's extraordinary value as a political asset. No other prisoner in Europe could command such a price, and no other captive could generate such international attention. The ransom negotiations became a test of strength between the imperial court and the Angevin Empire, with Richard's fate hanging in the balance between competing visions of medieval sovereignty. The news of Richard's capture reached England in February 1193, throwing the kingdom into a crisis that threatened to destroy the Angevin Empire. The chronicler Gervase of Canterbury recorded the initial panic that gripped the royal court. When word came that the king was taken, men spoke as if the sun had gone out of the sky. The realm that had been held together by the force of Richard's will now faced the prospect of dissolution. But the crisis also revealed the extraordinary character of Eleanor of Aquitaine, now 70 years old but still possessed of the political acumen that had made her one of the most powerful women in Europe. The Queen Mother, who had orchestrated the Great Rebellion of 1173, now channeled her formidable energies into the most important campaign of her life, the liberation of her son and the preservation of the Angevin inheritance. Eleanor's approach to the ransom crisis demonstrated the political skills that had enabled her to survive and thrive through decades of medieval power struggles. She understood that raising the enormous sum demanded by the emperor would require not merely the resources of the English crown, but the voluntary cooperation of every level of society. The campaign she organized was a masterpiece of political mobilization, combining practical fundraising with symbolic appeals to loyalty and duty. The methods used to raise Richard's ransom revealed both the strengths and limitations of medieval royal authority. The chronicler, William of Newburgh, recorded the extraordinary measures that were imposed throughout the Angevin territories. Every church was required to surrender its silver vessels, every monastery its treasures, every baron his accumulated wealth. The land groaned under the burden of taxation, but the people bore it willingly, for they knew that the Lionheart's freedom was the price of their own security. The collection of the ransom became a kind of national pilgrimage, with contributions flowing in from every corner of Richard's domains. Nobles mortgaged their estates, merchants contributed their profits, and even peasants offered their few silver coins to the cause. The chronicler, Gervase of Canterbury, noted the religious fervor that accompanied these contributions. Men gave not as subjects paying taxes, but as pilgrims making offerings, as if the liberation of their king were a sacred duty comparable to the liberation of the Holy Land. The success of the ransom campaign also demonstrated the depth of loyalty that Richard had inspired despite his long absences from England. The king, who had spent less than 6 months in his realm during 4 years of rule, had nevertheless captured the imagination of his subjects in ways that mere presence could never have achieved. The legend of the Lionheart had become more powerful than the reality of royal administration. While Eleanor organized the collection of the ransom, Richard himself was engaged in a complex diplomatic campaign designed to improve the terms of his release and limit the political damage of his captivity. The chronicler, Roger of Hoveden, recorded the skill with which the imprisoned king manipulated the competing interests of his captors, playing the Holy Roman Emperor against Duke Leopold, exploiting the tensions between imperial and papal authority, and gradually transforming his position from helpless prisoner to essential diplomatic partner. The negotiations that preceded Richard's release revealed the sophisticated political intelligence that had made him successful in the complex world of continental politics. Despite his physical captivity, Richard remained an active participant in the European balance of power, using his legendary reputation and personal charisma to influence events far beyond his prison walls. The man who had learned statecraft in the rebellious Duchy of Aquitaine proved that effective leadership could transcend the limitations of circumstance. Perhaps most importantly, Richard understood that his imprisonment had elevated his symbolic importance beyond his practical political value. The Lionheart in chains had become a more powerful figure than the Lionheart on the throne, a martyr hero whose suffering sanctified his cause and elevated his reputation above the mundane concerns of feudal politics. The very powerlessness of his situation had paradoxically increased his influence over the medieval imagination. The formal ceremonies surrounding Richard's release in February 1194 were carefully choreographed to minimize the humiliation of his captivity while maximizing the symbolic impact of his liberation. The chronicler Ambroise recorded the dramatic moment when the prison doors opened to reveal the king who had become the most famous man in Europe. When the Lionheart emerged from his captivity, men said that he seemed not diminished but transformed, as if his suffering had purified his legend and elevated his authority above earthly concerns. The journey from Germany to England became a triumphal procession that demonstrated the power of Richard's reputation to transcend political boundaries. In every town and city along the route, crowds gathered to witness the passage of the legendary king whose exploits had become the stuff of ballad and chronicle. The man who had entered captivity as a failed crusader emerged as a martyred hero whose moral authority had been enhanced rather than diminished by his ordeal. But Richard's first actions upon regaining his freedom revealed the pragmatic intelligence that had always guided his political calculations. Rather than seeking immediate revenge against his enemies or indulging in the kind of theatrical gestures that might have satisfied his wounded pride, he chose to focus on the practical task of re-establishing his authority and securing his territories against the threats that had emerged during his absence. The return to England in March 1194 brought Richard face to face with the consequences of his brother John's treachery during the captivity. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden recorded the tense confrontation between the brothers, which revealed both Richard's capacity for forgiveness and his shrewd understanding of political necessity. John had allied himself with Philip Augustus, attempted to seize the throne, and actively worked to prevent Richard's release. Yet, the king chose reconciliation over revenge. The decision to forgive John was not born of brotherly sentiment, but of hard-headed political calculation. Richard understood that civil war would serve only the interests of his enemies, particularly Philip Augustus, who had spent the years of the captivity systematically attacking the Angevin territories on the continent. The king, who had learned statecraft in the complex politics of Aquitaine, recognized that family loyalty, however strained, remained preferable to the uncertainties of dynastic conflict. The chronicler William of Newburgh recorded Richard's explanation of his decision. A brother's betrayal is a wound that heals with time, but a kingdom divided against itself is a wound that festers until it destroys all who bear it. John has played the fool, but he remains my heir and my kinsman. Better to bind him to me with forgiveness than to drive him to my enemies with severity.
The brief period of Richard's presence in England, barely 2 months before his departure for the continent in May 1194, demonstrated the impossible demands that medieval kingship placed on even the most capable rulers. The chronicler Gervase of Canterbury noted the frenetic activity that characterized these weeks: the reorganization of the royal administration, the settlement of disputes that had accumulated during the captivity, and the preparation for the continental campaign that would dominate the remainder of Richard's reign. But the king's priorities were clear from the moment of his return. England was valuable primarily as a source of resources for the defense of the Angevin territories that were under direct attack from Philip Augustus. The kingdom that had raised the enormous ransom for his release was now expected to finance another expensive military campaign, this time to recover the territories that had been lost during his absence. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden recorded the mixed response that greeted Richard's departure. The people rejoiced to see their king restored to freedom, but they grieved to see him depart so soon for wars that seemed to serve the interests of his continental subjects rather than his English ones. Yet they understood that the Lionheart's destiny lay not in the peaceful halls of Westminster, but in the clash of arms that had made him legendary. The campaign that began with Richard's return to Normandy in May 1194 was fought with a systematic intensity that had characterized his approach to the Crusade. The king, who had learned siege warfare in the rebellious Duchy of Aquitaine and perfected it in the Holy Land, now applied these skills to the recovery of territories that Philip Augustus had seized during the captivity. The chronicler Ambroise recorded the methodical precision with which Richard approached each fortress, each strategic position, each diplomatic opportunity. The siege of Vernon in May 1194 demonstrated that the skills that had made Richard famous in the Holy Land remained sharp despite his long imprisonment. The speed with which the fortress fell to his assault shocked contemporary observers and announced to the world that the Lionheart's military capabilities had not been diminished by his ordeal. The chronicler Geoffrey of Vinsauf noted the psychological impact of this victory. When news spread that Verneuil had fallen in a single day, men said that the old Richard had returned, that the legend of the Lionheart was not merely memory but living reality. But the campaign also revealed the limitations of Richard's strategic position. The years of captivity had allowed Philip Augustus to consolidate his gains and build alliances that would make the recovery of lost territories far more difficult than their initial conquest. The war that began in 1194 would continue for the remainder of Richard's reign, a grinding conflict that would test every aspect of his military and political skills. The construction of Château Gaillard, the mighty fortress that Richard built to guard the approaches to Rouen, represented the culmination of his evolution from warrior king to master of medieval military architecture. The chronicler Ambroise recorded the king's personal involvement in every aspect of the castle's design, from the innovative concentric defenses to the strategic positioning that commanded the entire Seine Valley. This was not merely a military installation, but a statement of artistic and technological achievement that would outlast its creator. The speed with which Château Gaillard was completed, less than 2 years from conception to completion, demonstrated the extraordinary resources that Richard could still command, despite the financial strain of the ransom and the ongoing war. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden noted that the king personally supervised the construction, living in a simple hut among the workers and sharing their dangers and hardships. This was the kind of personal leadership that had always distinguished Richard from his contemporaries. But the castle also represented something more profound: the transformation of military necessity into artistic achievement. The man who had learned his trade in the practical siege warfare of Aquitaine had evolved into a creative genius whose innovations in military architecture would influence castle design for generations. Château Gaillard was not merely a fortress, but a monument to the intellectual development of its creator. The events that led to Richard's final campaign in the Limousin region of Aquitaine revealed the continuing importance of his southern heritage in shaping his political priorities. The chronicler Geoffrey of Vinsauf recorded the complex web of feudal obligations and personal loyalties that drew Richard into what appeared to be a minor provincial conflict, but which actually involved fundamental questions about the nature of ducal authority in Aquitaine. The siege of Châlus-Chabrol in March 1199 was typical of the countless small-scale operations that had characterized Richard's career since his youth. The fortress was not particularly strong, the garrison was not particularly skilled, and the strategic importance of the position was not particularly significant. Yet the king's decision to personally supervise the siege revealed the hands-on approach to leadership that had always distinguished him from rulers who preferred to command from a distance. The chronicler Ambroise recorded the almost casual atmosphere that pervaded the siege during its early days.
Richard appeared frequently in the trenches, encouraging the workers and discussing tactical details with his engineers. This was the kind of personal involvement that had made him beloved by his followers and that had earned him the reputation as a leader who shared the dangers of those he commanded. The crossbow bolt that struck Richard on the evening of March 25, 1199 was fired from the walls of Châlus-Chabrol by a defender whose name the chroniclers recorded as Pierre Basile. The wound was not immediately fatal, but the king's refusal to seek proper medical treatment, he insisted on continuing to direct the siege from his tent, transformed what might have been a minor injury into a mortal infection. The chronicler Roger of Hoven noted the tragic irony. The man who had survived the greatest battles of his age was brought down by a chance shot in an insignificant siege. The 12 days that elapsed between Richard's wounding and his death on April 6, 1199, were filled with the kind of dramatic gestures that had characterized his entire career. The chronicler Ambrose recorded the king's final acts: his forgiveness of the crossbowman who had wounded him, his arrangements for the distribution of his treasure, and his final confession to the Archbishop of Rouen. These were not merely the conventional preparations for death, but the conscious crafting of a legacy that would outlive the man. Perhaps most significantly, Richard's final instructions revealed his understanding of the symbolic importance of his burial. Rather than choosing Westminster Abbey or some other royal mausoleum, he directed that his body be interred at Fontevraud, the monastery that had become the spiritual center of the Angevin dynasty. This was not merely a practical decision, but a symbolic statement about the sources of his identity and the nature of his achievement. The transformation of Richard from historical figure to legendary hero began almost immediately after his death. The chronicler Geoffrey of Venizove recorded the extraordinary outpouring of grief that greeted news of the king's death. In every court and castle, in every monastery and market town, men spoke of the Lionheart's passing as they might speak of the end of an age. The king who had embodied the highest ideals of chivalry was gone, and with him something irreplaceable had departed from the world. The ballads and chronicles that began to appear within months of Richard's death revealed the selective process by which historical memory is constructed. The complex, sometimes contradictory figure who had actually lived was gradually transformed into the idealized hero who would dominate medieval literature for centuries. The failures and compromises that had marked his actual career were forgotten, while his moments of greatest triumph were elevated to mythic status. The chronicler Amboise, who had witnessed many of Richard's greatest achievements, noted the curious process by which legend replaced reality. The man who had been our king was mortal, subject to the weaknesses and limitations that constrain all human endeavor. But the Lionheart who lives in song and story is eternal, a perfect embodiment of the chivalric ideal that remains forever young, forever brave, forever true to the highest aspirations of Christian knighthood. The role of Eleanor of Aquitaine in shaping her son's posthumous reputation cannot be overstated. The Queen Mother, who had orchestrated the Great Rebellion of 1173 and the ransom campaign of 1193, now devoted her final years to the most important project of her life: the creation of a literary monument to Richard's memory that would ensure his place in the eternal pantheon of chivalric heroes. The court at Poitiers, which had been the center of troubadour culture during Richard's youth, became the workshop where his legend was refined and perfected. The chronicler, Geoffrey of Vinsauf, recorded the careful attention that Eleanor paid to every detail of the emerging Richard mythology. The Queen Mother understood that her son's true kingdom was not the realm of England or the Duchy of Aquitaine, but the empire of memory that could be conquered only through the artistry of those who shape the stories by which men live. The songs and stories that emerged from this literary workshop transformed Richard from a skilled but flawed medieval ruler into the perfect embodiment of chivalric virtue. The Lionheart of the troubadours was not merely brave, but perfectly courageous, not merely skilled in war, but invincible in battle, not merely devoted to the crusading cause, but willing to sacrifice everything for the liberation of the Holy Land. The cruel irony of Richard's reputation was that his greatest achievement as King of England was his absence from the kingdom. The chronicler William of Newburgh observed,
that Richard's legend grew stronger with each month that he spent away from his nominal realm. The king who was never present became more real to his subjects than any ruler who might have remained among them. The Lionheart who lived in their imagination was more valuable than any flesh and blood monarch who might have concerned himself with the mundane details of governance. This paradox reflected the fundamental nature of medieval kingship, which was based more on symbolic authority than administrative efficiency. The king who appeared regularly in the Great Hall of Westminster, who settled disputes between merchants and monitored the collection of taxes, would have been respected, but not revered. The king who fought Saladin in the Holy Land and suffered imprisonment for the honor of Christendom became something approaching a secular saint. The chronicler Gervase of Canterbury noted the transformation in how Richard's subjects spoke of their absent king. When men told stories of the Lionheart's exploits, they spoke not as subjects recounting the deeds of their ruler, but as believers sharing the legends of their hero. The king who had left England as a man returned to it as a myth, more powerful in absence than he had ever been in presence.
The image of Richard that emerged from the chronicles and ballads of the 13th century was that of the eternal Crusader, the Christian knight whose devotion to the Holy Land had elevated him above the political compromises and moral ambiguities that constrained ordinary rulers. The chronicler Matthew Paris, writing a generation after Richard's death, captured this transformation. The Lionheart had become not merely a king who had taken the cross, but the living embodiment of the crusading ideal, the perfect fusion of martial prowess and spiritual devotion that represented the highest achievement of Christian civilization. This idealized Richard bore little resemblance to the complex historical figure who had actually lived. The man who had massacred prisoners at Acre, who had bankrupted his kingdom to finance his wars, who had spent his entire career in rebellion against paternal authority, was transformed into a spotless hero whose every action was motivated by the purest devotion to Christian duty. The process of legend-making required the elimination of moral complexity in favor of symbolic clarity. But the mythic Richard also reflected genuine historical achievements that deserved to be remembered. The king who had restored Christian morale after the disasters of Hattin, who had proven that Saladin's armies could be defeated, who had secured the coastal cities that would remain Christian strongholds for another century, had indeed earned a place among the great heroes of the crusading movement. The legend was built on a foundation of real accomplishment. However, selectively that accomplishment was remembered. The assessment of Richard's actual historical importance has varied dramatically across the centuries, but his symbolic significance has remained constant. The chronicler Matthew Paris, writing in the 13th century, established the template for later evaluations. The Lionheart may have been absent from his kingdom, but he was present in the hearts of his people. His true realm was not the territory he governed, but the imagination he inspired. Modern historians have been more critical of Richard's practical achievements, noting the financial burden that his wars imposed on England and the instability that his long absences created in the Angevin territories. But even the most skeptical assessments acknowledge the extraordinary nature of his military achievements and the profound impact that his legend had on the development of medieval culture. The Richard who emerges from contemporary scholarship is neither the spotless hero of medieval romance nor the irresponsible adventurer of Victorian historiography, but a complex figure whose contradictions reflect the broader tensions of his age. The man who bankrupted his kingdom to finance his wars also demonstrated that Christian armies could match the military innovations of their Muslim enemies. The king who spent barely 6 months in England during his 10-year reign also inspired a loyalty that transcended the normal bonds of feudal obligation. The title Coeur de Lion ultimately transcended its military origins to become a symbol of the kind of leadership that inspires devotion across centuries. The chronicler Ambroise, reflecting on the evolution of Richard's reputation, noted that the name had acquired meanings that went far beyond its original context. The Lionheart represents not merely courage in battle, but the willingness to sacrifice everything for the principles that give life meaning. In an age of compromise and accommodation, he stood for the possibility of absolute commitment to absolute ideals. This symbolic Richard has proven more durable than the historical kingdoms he ruled. The Angevin Empire collapsed within a generation of his death. The crusading states eventually fell to Muslim reconquest, and the medieval world that had shaped his character was transformed by forces that no individual could control. But the legend of the Lionheart has endured, continuing to inspire new generations of artists, writers, and dreamers who find in his story a reflection of their own highest aspirations. The chronicler Geoffrey of Arsuf, writing in the decades after Richard's death, captured the essential meaning of the Lionheart legend. In the end, it matters less whether Richard was the greatest king of his age than whether he was the greatest inspiration. The man who lived for 32 years on this earth has been dead for generations, but the hero who emerged from his story will live as long as men value courage, honor, and the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for higher purpose. The Richard who died at Châlus-Chabrol on April 6, 1199, was a mortal man whose body was laid to rest in the monastery of Fontevraud beside his father and mother. But the Lionheart who emerged from the chronicles and ballads of succeeding generations was something more than human. A distillation of the medieval ideal of kingship that continued to inspire long after the political circumstances that had created it had passed away. The chronicler Ambrose, in his final assessment of Richard's legacy, noted the paradox that had defined his career from beginning to end. The king who was least present in his kingdom became most present in its memory. The ruler who spent his life in pursuit of a heavenly city he never conquered achieved a kind of immortality that no earthly victory could have provided. This was perhaps the final irony of Richard's extraordinary career. The man who had sought glory through the conquest of Jerusalem found immortality through the conquest of the human imagination. The Lionheart who had failed to liberate the Holy Land had succeeded in liberating something more valuable, the dream of heroic possibility that continues to inspire those who refuse to accept the limitations of their circumstances. The legend of Richard Coeur de Lion reminds us that the greatest victories are not always military, that the most important conquests are not always territorial, and that the most enduring kingdoms are not always political. In the end, the Lionheart's truest realm was the empire of memory, where heroes never die, and the highest ideals of human achievement remain forever young, forever brave, forever true to the vision of what we might become if we possessed the courage to dream greatly and the determination to pursue those dreams to their ultimate conclusion. The man who had earned his title through courage at Arsuf and wisdom in the approach to Jerusalem had finally achieved the immortality that had always eluded him in life. The Lionheart was dead, but the legend of the Lionheart would prove eternal. A reminder that in the struggle between the forces of order and chaos, between the claims of the ideal and the demands of the real, the human spirit can still achieve victories that transcend the limitations of mortality and inspire hope across the centuries.
Subscribe and welcome to the Empire.